Montana Territory, April 1883. The river had been high for 3 days, swollen with snow melt and the restless roar of spring. People in the town of Alder Creek kept their distance from it, everyone but her. Nella Langford gripped her skirts in one hand and climbed down the muddy slope, boots slipping in the wet grass. She had not meant to walk this far, but the trees had opened up and the sound of rushing water had pulled her in. She should have turned back. The current was fast, the banks soft. But she had not. Later, she would not remember if she tripped or if the ground gave way. All she knew was the cold, the weightlessness, the pull. She fell into the rushing river. The water swallowed her scream. It tugged her under, pulled her dress tight across her legs. She kicked hard, surfaced once, gulped air, and was dragged down again. Her hands clawed for something, anything. There was nothing. Then boots pounding above her, a shout. She caught a glimpse of a man's shadow racing the edge, his hat flying off. A splash. The cold deepened as he hit the water. Strong arms reached through the current, caught her beneath the arms, and held fast. The river tried to take them both, but he cursed low and kicked hard, angling toward the far bank. They hit the mud in a tangle. He hauled her from the water, staggering back until they collapsed together on the shore. She coughed, choked, turned her face, and spat up water. "Breathe," he said, voice hoarse. "You are all right." She blinked up at him, shivering, hair stuck to her cheek, lungs burning. His face hovered above her tanned skin, a sharp jaw, dark eyes wide with concern. "Who? Jackson Vance?" he said, pushing wet hair from her face with one trembling hand. "Cowhand out of Bitterroot Ranch. You nearly drowned." Nella sat up, coughing again. "I slipped. I saw." He peeled off his soaked gloves and ran a hand over his face. His shirt clung to him, soaked through, and his breath came heavy. He looked younger than she thought at first, maybe mid-20s, and strong. Real strong. "You should not have been near the edge," he said, not unkindly. "I was not trying to be foolish," she said, voice shaking. "It just happened so fast." He nodded and stood, offering her a hand. She took it. His palm was rough and warm despite the water. He pulled her gently to her feet. "Come on," he said, glancing at the sky thick with spring clouds. "You need a dry fire and something warm in you before you freeze." He led her across the field toward a line of cottonwoods. Beneath them, he had left his horse tied and a bedroll unrolled near a small fire pit, now smoldering low. "I was making coffee," he said, "before I saw you fall." She knelt beside the fire, and he worked quick to stoke it back to life. She watched his hands steady, sure. He shed his coat and draped it over her shoulders without asking. "Thank you," she murmured. "You got a name?" he asked, settling across from her. "Nella Langford. I am staying at the boarding house in town." He nodded. "You from here?" "No. Kansas, originally. Came to Alder Creek last fall." "Family?" She looked down. "No. Not anymore." He said nothing, just watched her carefully, like he could read the rest in her silence. "What about you?" she asked after a moment. Jackson shrugged. "Been riding cattle since I was 16. No family left either." They sat quiet. The fire crackled. The wind shifted and the smell of wet grass filled the space between them. "You saved my life," she said softly. "I just saw someone needed help," he said. "That is not nothing." He looked at her then, really looked. "You are shivering." He stood and reached for his saddlebag, pulling out a thick wool blanket. He came around behind her and wrapped it around her shoulders, his hands brushing her arms. She did not flinch. Their eyes met again. Something passed between them, warm, quiet, real. "You all right now?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. "Because of you." They sat there until the sun dropped behind the hills, the river still rushing in the distance. When she stood to leave, he walked her back to town, his horse trailing behind them. Outside the boarding house, she turned to him. "Jackson," she said. Will you come by tomorrow? I would like to thank you properly. His eyes searched hers. I will. She smiled small, but full of something that had not been there before. He touched the brim of his hat, then turned and walked off into the dusk, leaving her heart beating faster than it should. The morning after, mist clung to the edges of Alder Creek like a breath not yet exhaled. Nella stood at the window of her small upstairs room, watching the street below stir to life. A freight wagon rattled past. Two men crossed to the mercantile, boots loud on the boardwalk. The river, hidden from view, still hummed in her ears. She had not slept much. Her limbs ached from the cold, and her chest still felt bruised from the water, but it was not pain that kept her awake. It was the feel of someone's hand steadying her, the quiet certainty of a man who did not look away when things turned hard. She pressed her hand lightly to the sill, skin pale against the morning light. Then she turned and opened the wardrobe, choosing the dark blue dress with the high collar, simple, but clean and mended. Her best pair of boots waited by the door. Downstairs, Mrs. Cray was kneading dough at the kitchen table. She barely looked up. You're up early. I've errands, Nella said. Mrs. Cray's brow lifted slightly. You ought to rest. Heard about what happened down by the river. Man from the livery saw you come back soaked to the bone. I'm fine. She tied her shawl and stepped into the street. The mud had dried some since yesterday, but the edges of the road were still soft. She walked with care, skirts gathered in one hand, and turned toward the far end of town, where the hills began to rise again and the land opened into pasture. She did not know where Jackson rode out from each morning, but she remembered the direction he'd come from when he walked her home. It took over an hour of walking, and her feet were aching by the time she reached the split-rail fence that marked the edge of the Bitterroot Range. A boy no older than 12 sat on the gatepost, whittling. Looking for someone? He asked without lifting his eyes. Jackson Vance. Is he on the ranch today? His knife paused mid-cut. He's out in the south field, checking calves. You're Miss Langford, ain't you? Heard you near drowned. I did. The boy nodded solemnly. He was real quiet this morning. Didn't eat his biscuit. She followed the trail he pointed out, weaving between low oak scrub and the scent of damp earth. The sun had begun to burn through the mist, and by the time she crested a small rise she saw him. Jackson stood with one foot braced on a fallen log, watching a cow nudge her newborn to stand. He didn't turn when she approached. You didn't come for your thanks, she said. He looked over his shoulder, surprised, but not startled. Didn't think you'd walk this far. I needed to. He stepped down from the log and brushed his hands on his trousers. You all right today? I've been worse. I figured you might rest. She didn't answer that. Instead, she stepped closer. That calf going to make it? Looks strong. Stubborn, though. Like its mother. She looked at him then, really looked. The way the light hit the edge of his jaw, the faint shadow beneath his eyes. He hadn't slept either. Did you think about it all night, too? She asked softly. Some, he admitted, gaze fixed on the calf. I keep thinking how quick it was. One step, and I was gone. You came back. Because you jumped. He didn't speak right away. The calf wobbled and took its first step. He let out a breath. I've seen that river take a man before, he said finally. Saw it last spring, up near Helena. Couldn't get to him in time. I'm not him. No. You're not. She reached out then, brushing her fingers lightly against his coat sleeve. He didn't move away. I wasn't planning to stay in Alder Creek long, she said. Didn't think it was a place you could make a life. His voice was quiet. What changed? I'm not sure yet. But I think something might have. The calf stumbled again, and Jackson stepped forward to steady it with a practiced touch. When he turned back, his eyes met hers clear, steady, and something else. Something beginning. Come back to the house, he said. There's coffee. Real strong. And a dry chair. And a biscuit? His mouth turned up faintly. I didn't eat mine. You can have it. She smiled, and together they walked toward the ranch house, the sun finally warming the morning behind them. The ranch house stood low and wide beneath the cottonwoods, its clapboard siding weathered to the color of old ash. A stovepipe sent up a thin plume of smoke, and the scent of dry cedar hung faint on the breeze. Jackson opened the door and stepped aside, his hand brushing Nella's lower back as she passed. The touch was light, but she felt it all the way through. Inside, the room was spare but solid. A pine table near the hearth held a tin coffee pot, a half-carved length of wood, and a folded map weighted by a river stone. A single shelf above the stove held 3 books, a clay pipe, and a brass candlestick. No ornament, no softness. Just the essentials of a man's life. You live alone out here? She asked, setting her shawl on the back of a chair. Most of the year, yes. The other hands bunk in the south cabin. I take the main house since I keep the books and winter stock. He poured 2 cups of coffee, handed her one. The handle was warm, and the bitter scent curled into her throat like smoke. You keep the books? She asked. Someone has to. The boss's eyesight went poor last year. I rode for him long enough, he trusts me with the figures. Nella took a sip and eased into the chair. The warmth of it steadied her hands. I didn't expect that. He leaned against the far wall, arms crossed. Didn't expect what? That you'd be the type to do numbers. I ride fence and break colts same as anyone, he said, one brow lifting. But I had a father who made me learn to read before I was tall enough to saddle my own horse. She watched his face shift, just a little, when he mentioned his father. Was he strict? No, Jackson said. Just tired. He wanted me to have something steady to lean on, in case the land ever gave out under me. Did it? He looked down at his boots. Eventually. The silence between them settled into something not uncomfortable, just full. Nella traced the rim of her cup with one finger. I came west thinking I might teach again, she said. There was a schoolhouse in Abilene where I worked 3 years. After I left, I thought maybe somewhere smaller would be kinder. You were a teacher? I still am most days. The children in Alder Creek meet me in the church loft. I have to keep the coal stove lit myself, but they come. He smiled faintly. Town's better for it. She stood and crossed to the books above the stove. One of them was a volume of Shakespeare, the spine frayed near the middle. She ran her thumb along the edge. You read this? Some. When the nights get long. She turned, surprised. Which part? The Tempest. There's a line in there I remember. Something about hearts being tied by magic. That's not common reading for a ranch hand, she said, watching him closely. I don't figure much about me is. Nella set the book down and walked to the window. Outside, the hills sloped toward open pasture where wind scattered dust across the grass. A red-tailed hawk drifted low, wings still. She watched it tilt, then vanish over the ridge. I haven't let someone sit beside me in a long time, she said quietly. You didn't seem afraid. I was. But not of you. Jackson stepped forward, his boots soft on the wide plank floor. He stopped just behind her, not touching, but close enough that she felt the heat of him. You don't have to say anything now, he said. But I'd sit beside you again if you let me. She turned, and the light from the window caught the side of his face. There was no demand in his eyes, no hunger. Just steadiness. Like good earth after a hard storm. I think I'd like that, she said. He took her empty cup, set it gently on the table. I ride out again in the morning. But there's supper on at dusk. Salt pork and beans, if nothing else. I'll come. His eyes held hers a moment longer, then he nodded once. She stepped out into the afternoon, boots crunching on gravel, and walked back toward town with her shawl tucked close and her heart steadier than it had been in months. Behind her, the ranch house door swung shut, and she heard the soft creak of Jackson moving inside, as if the rhythm of her steps had become something familiar already. By the time supper's shadows stretched long across the bitterroot pasture, the wind had calmed and the sky turned a soft violet. Nella walked the last stretch of the path with her basket tucked in the crook of her arm. She'd baked cornbread that morning, coarse yellow squares wrapped in a linen cloth that once belonged to her mother. She hadn't used it since Kansas. Jackson was outside, kneeling near the woodpile, splitting kindling with practiced rhythm. When he saw her, he stood slowly, wiping his palms on his trousers. "You came," he said, voice quieter than the axe that thudded into the stump behind him. "I said I would," she replied, holding out the basket. "Thought I'd bring something to go with whatever's on your stove." He opened the cloth, then looked at her like she'd handed him something finer than bread. "Sit a spell. I'll pull it off the fire." Inside, she eased into the chair nearest the window while he ladled beans from the pot into 2 tin bowls. The cornbread went between them on a worn board, and he passed her a knife with the handle worn smooth. They ate without hurry. The food was plain, but warm, and the quiet between them had grown easier. Outside, a pair of horses moved slow through the near pasture, their silhouettes long in the fading light. Jackson set his spoon aside. "What brought you west, really?" "I wasn't running," she said, meeting his eyes. "But I wasn't rooted either. The town I left had too many memories, and not enough future." He nodded once. "That fair?" Nella folded her hands in her lap. "I thought if I could find a place where no one knew me, I might build something new. Not grand. Just steady." "You think Alder Creek might be that?" "I'm not certain yet," she said. "But I'm not looking past it anymore." He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, studying her. "You read much?" "I did. Not so much these days. I miss it." He stood and crossed to the shelf near the hearth. "Take any you like. They're gathering dust, and I've read them enough times to know where the pages stick." She rose and scanned the titles. Her fingers hovered over a worn volume of essays, then paused at a cloth-bound ledger wedged between 2 hard covers. "What's this?" "Old trail book. I kept it the year we drove cattle from Miles City to Cheyenne. Wrote down what I saw. May I?" He nodded. She opened to the middle, where ink had bled into the paper from weather. A line caught her eye. "Camped beneath red cliffs, sky full of lightning. Cold born under thunder. You wrote this?" "I did. It's beautiful." He shifted, slightly uncomfortable. "Weren't meant to be." "It is anyway," she said. The light had gone full gold outside, and the edges of the room blurred with shadow. She stepped back from the shelf and turned toward him. "I never thought I'd feel safe near someone again," she said. "And I don't mean just the river." He stepped toward her, slow and sure. "You are." She didn't look away. "Then stay near." He reached out, touched her hand with the same steadiness he'd shown with the calf that morning. No rush, no question. Just presence. She turned her fingers into his, and they stood that way, quiet and still, while the last of the daylight slipped away. Later, he walked her back to town, and neither of them spoke much. But when he stopped outside the boarding house gate, and she looked up at him, her eyes held something anchored this time, not just hope. "I'll see you tomorrow?" she asked. "You will." And when they parted, neither looked back. They didn't need to. Nella's boots sank slightly into the soft earth as she stepped into the paddock yard, the hem of her skirt catching a thread of burr grass. She had taken the long way from the boarding house, past the edge of town, past the old mill wheel that hadn't turned since before winter. The air was warm for May, and the scent of sun-warmed pine drifted from the hills. Jackson was near the stable, brushing down a dun-colored mare. His sleeves were rolled, and a smear of dust traced the muscle of his forearm. When he heard her steps, he turned, the brush pausing mid-stroke. "There's someone I'd like you to meet," Nella said, a sliver of steel in her voice. "But I need to ask first." He set the brush on the rail. "Ask? Do you mean to stay in Alder Creek?" He didn't hesitate. "I do." She nodded once, then stepped aside. A girl of about 8, barefoot and freckled, peeked out from behind the gate post. Her hair was the same soft brown as Nella's, though longer and uncombed. "This is Clara," Nella said. "My niece. My sister's girl." Jackson's eyes flicked from the child to Nella. "You never said? I wasn't sure I could trust it yet. Us. That it was real enough to bring her into." Clara crept forward, wary, clutching an old quilt square in one hand. Jackson crouched to her height, resting his forearms on his knees. "Hello, Clara," he said. She didn't answer, but she didn't run either. "I board her with Mrs. Cray during lessons," Nella said. "And I teach the rest of the time. We manage, but it's not easy. I'm glad you brought her," Jackson said softly, still watching Clara. "She looks like she likes horses." The child's eyes darted to the mare, then back to him. She gave one short nod. "You want to help me feed her?" he asked. Clara glanced at Nella, who gave a small tilt of her head. With slow steps, Clara moved beside Jackson. He handed her a tin scoop, and she took it with both hands. They disappeared into the stable, and Nella leaned a hand on the rail, the quiet inside her chest spreading wider than it had in years. When they emerged, Clara had hay in her hair and a bit of grain on her dress. She didn't seem to notice. Jackson carried a water pail in one hand and looked at Nella as if a door had opened between them. "She's welcome here," he said. "I hoped you'd say that." After supper that evening, they sat on the back step. Clara had fallen asleep earlier in the parlor, curled like a cat on Jackson's old wool coat. Only the chirr of tree crickets broke the stillness. "I always thought love would feel like fire," Nella said. "But it doesn't. Not this. It feels like quiet." Jackson's hand rested near hers on the step. He didn't take it right away. He waited, as he always did, until she leaned into him first. "I never had a picture of what a life might be," he said. "Not one that lasted past next spring's herd. But now I do." She turned to look at him, and there was no fear left in her. "I want to stay." "Then stay." They didn't kiss that night. Not yet. But when he closed the door behind them, he carried Clara gently to the cot near the hearth, and Nella followed without a word, as if the house already belonged to them all. The wedding came in late June, under the cottonwoods behind the ranch house. Reverend Mallory from town came out in his heavy coat, sweating through the short ceremony while Clara tossed wildflowers into the grass with solemn purpose. The townsfolk brought pies and fiddle music, and someone lent a quilt they could stand on while they made their vows. Jackson wore his best shirt, the one with the silver-buttoned cuffs. Nella wore her mother's brooch pinned beneath her collar. When the sun dropped behind the hills that day, she was no longer alone. Summer passed with fence mending and lessons, with Clara riding bareback around the yard and Jackson building a second room onto the house with his own callous hands. Nella took to keeping a small garden near the porch. She planted mint, and it spread. By the time the first frost came, there was a shelf of her books beside Jackson's trail journal, and the house smelled of cedar and lamp oil and bread. Sometimes at night, when the fire was low and the wind slipped down from the ridge, Jackson would read aloud from the old volume of Shakespeare, his voice quiet as the ticking clock. He always stopped before the end, setting the book aside to watch her face in the firelight. And she would reach for him without speaking, her hand finding his, their fingers twining in that easy, settled way they had grown into. They had no need for magic to tie their hearts. They had built something steadier. Something that held. And so they stayed.